In the early 1800s, free black men, women, and children were kidnapped on the streets of Philadelphia and New York City at an alarming rate. The kidnappers were professional slave catchers and New York City police officers. The kidnappings were in compliance with the Fugitive Slave Act. Free black men, women, and children were falsely accused of being fugitive slaves and kidnapped for the sole purpose of gaining wealth. These captives were immediately whisked off to the Deep South and sold into slavery. They would never see their families again. The first Africans arrived at the English colony of Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. The Virginia Slave Codes of 1705 classified blacks as slaves. Free blacks, during the colonial period, were generally the mixed-race offspring of slave owners who granted them freedom from slavery. The Revolutionary War, the War for American Independence, began in 1775 and ended in 1783. Thousands of slaves who served in the Revolutionary War were emancipated. Thousands of masters freed slaves because they were no longer productive due to age or poor health. At the conclusion of the Revolutionary War, thousands of slaves freed themselves from bondage by running away. States north of the Mason-Dixon line, such as Pennsylvania, were or became free states by abolishing slavery. States south of the Mason-Dixon line, such as Maryland, were slave-holding states, which continued the practice of slavery until the conclusion of the Civil War. The Constitution's Fugitive Slave Clause, a compromise between the free and slave-holding states, required northern states to return runaway slaves to their southern enslavers. The Fugitive Slave Clause became part of the Constitution in 1793. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, another compromise between the free and slave-holding states, was enacted by Congress. The act authorized local governments to seize and return runaway slaves to their owners. Private slave catchers or bounty hunters could profit from capturing runaway slaves by returning them to their owners for a bounty, or by selling them to interested parties, such as slave traders and plantation owners, and pocketing the proceeds. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 and subsequently the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 denied alleged fugitive slaves fair trials, due process of law, or even the right to prove their freedom in court. The Fugitive Slave Acts violated the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th Amendments, as well as the Constitution's protection of the writ of habeas corpus. The 4th Amendment guarantees the right of the people to be secure in their persons from unreasonable searches and seizures. The 1793 and 1850 laws authorize private individuals to seize or arrest alleged fugitive slaves without any warrant or other judicial scrutiny. Slave catchers seized blacks in public and invaded the private homes of blacks in search of fugitive slaves. These actions were in violation of the 4th Amendment. The 5th Amendment declares that no person can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, the alleged fugitive slaves were not allowed to testify on their own behalf, even to assert a case of mistaken identity. The 6th Amendment requires that trials be before an impartial jury and that defendants have a right to subpoena witnesses on their behalf and have assistance of counsel. The 7th Amendment guaranteed jury trial in civil cases. The Fugitive Slave Acts denied alleged fugitive slaves these constitutional rights. As a result of these unconstitutional laws, alleged fugitive slaves could be on their way to life of bondage in the Deep South within a matter of hours after being captured. An alleged fugitive slave was not given the time to prepare a defense, find an attorney, or summon witnesses. The Constitution protects the right of a writ of habeas corpus, which ensures that people who are arrested will be brought before a court for a trial. The Fugitive Slave Acts did not provide alleged fugitive slaves with the right to a trial. In 1808, the United States banned the import of slaves from Africa. The ban was a boost to the domestic slave trade and drove up the price of slaves who were bred in the United States. At about this time, the cotton gin was invented and made the cultivation of cotton profitable in the South. Cotton became the fabric of choice for European and American clothing manufacturers. Cotton became a key component of Britain's Industrial Revolution. Britain was the major purchaser of Southern cotton and was dependent on Southern cotton plantations. In fact, Britain financed southern cotton plantations, thus allowing them to purchase land, slaves, equipment, and supplies. British financial institutions issued slave-backed bonds to investors around the globe. Investors from anywhere in the world could profit from slavery without having to own slaves. New York financial institutions also financed southern cotton plantations. The availability of capital further drove up the price of slaves. By the 1830s, the United States became the leading global supplier of raw cotton. Slave labor gave the United States a competitive edge over other global cotton producers, such as India and South America. In order to increase cotton production, the federal government forcibly removed Native Americans' tribes from their homelands in the Deep South and relocated them westward. The government's actions created millions of acres of land for cotton cultivation in places like Mississippi. The government then sold the land, at a cheap price, to white settlers so that they could grow cotton. Since producing raw cotton is labor-intensive, the demand for slaves increased dramatically, as did the price of slaves. In an attempt to meet the demand for slaves, approximately 1 million slaves were transported from the Upper South to the Deep South by slave traders and profitably sold at slave auctions. Nonetheless, an ever-increasing demand for slaves continued right up until the Civil War. An individual slave was worth tens of thousands of dollars in today's dollars. Plantation owners in the South, who relied on slave labor, readily purchased black captives, both fugitive slaves and free blacks, from slave catchers. The fear of being kidnapped was one of the greatest concerns of free blacks in pre-Civil War America. Slave catchers kidnapped free blacks in northern free states and sold them into slavery in the South. The kidnapping of free blacks was most prevalent in northern free states, such as Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, that bordered southern slave-holding states, such as Maryland and Kentucky. Some slave catchers simply lured black people, who resided in northern free states, into entering a southern slave-holding state by offering a job or some other opportunity. Once these black people entered a southern slave-holding state, they would be captured by slave catchers and sold into slavery. These captives could end up working for the rest of their life on a cotton plantation in the Deep South. Teams of professional slave catchers prowled the streets of Philadelphia looking for black people to kidnap. Kidnapper teams would employ violence to capture a free black person in a city like Philadelphia. Slave catchers would even kidnap black people by means of home invasions. The captives would then be whisked from Philadelphia to Maryland, just 40 miles away. Baltimore had a large network of slave traders who bought and sold slaves for profit. Slave traders could purchase black captives in Baltimore, transport them to New Orleans and Natchez, and then sell them at slave auctions. In Philadelphia, slave catchers targeted children who were not old enough to know that they were being kidnapped. Kidnappers grabbed children off the street and whisked them away to the South. These children would be sold into slavery. In New York City, slave catchers and the New York City Police Department worked hand in hand to capture both fugitive slaves and free black people. Police officers who did not wear uniforms at the time patrolled New York Harbor looking for black people who they could accuse of being fugitive slaves. Black people, both fugitive slaves and free blacks, would then be arrested, and with the approval of the New York City courts, sold into slavery. In the 1830s and 40s, this was known as the Kidnapping Club. The Kidnapping Club was a network of judges, lawyers, police officers, and bankers who sanctioned the kidnapping of New York City's black residents, both fugitive slaves and free blacks, and their sale into slavery in the Deep South. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, one of the most unfair and illegal laws in American history, was formally repealed by Congress in June of 1864.